I want to talk about collective consciousness um, and the paradox of individualism in modern societies. The concept comes from Emil Durkheim, and I'm going to take one of his definitions, but I'm not going to try to explain um, Durkheim's ideas or its shortcomings or things related to it. We have done that before, and we'll do it again in different contexts. But at the moment, I just want to take his definition and develop some thoughts regarding collective consciousness and individualism in modern society. So I'm going to use his ideas, but I'm not going to try to claim, I'm not going to claim that I'm explaining his ideas as such. Okay, so basically what I'm going to take from Durkheim is one of his definitions of collective consciousness, which comes in this collective consciousness he defined it as the body of beliefs. Obviously this is from translation, so and I haven't checked the translation, so but I'm just going to take the definition here. The body of beliefs or collection of beliefs, yeah, and sentiments common to the average members of a society. So according to this definition, every society has its collective consciousness. And we don't have to quibble about average, but these are beliefs and sentiments which are widespread in a society. And if there aren't any widespread common beliefs, sentiments, ideals, then that society, there's no society as such. And we don't actually, it's very hard to imagine a society without this. So that's not what is at stake. But what is at stake is if you can accept this or similar definition of collective consciousness or existence of collective consciousness and relate that concept of collective consciousness to individual consciousness in a variety of different ways. So one way to relate collective consciousness to individual consciousness is to just think that collective consciousness is the sum total of individual consciousness. So according to this definition, collective consciousness is nothing but basically a collection of the sum total of individual consciousness. But that's not what Durkheim is claiming. For Durkheim, collective consciousness is something above and beyond individual consciousness or sum total of individual consciousness in a society. So collective consciousness is not the same thing as sum total of individual consciousness. So we have three things here which exist in a society. Individual consciousness, people have different consciousnesses, how much they share, a worldview or ideals with each other. It's individuals have their own differences. And then you can, add them up. And theoretically speaking, at any time, you can add the existing individual consciousnesses in a society, and that would be a set of individual consciousness. But that's not what collective consciousness is for Durkheim. Collective consciousness is something which exists independently of these two other concepts. So, and I agree with Durkheim on that, but the question is, how do we account for it? This question doesn't arise for other two concepts because individual consciousness is related to individual, and we consider an individual as an agent with his or her own will. So that individual consciousness is supported by his body, his soul, whatever. On the other hand, a collective conception of collective consciousness as a sum total of individual consciousnesses, you don't need to account for that either, because it's just sum total of the existing individual consciousnesses. But if you claim that there is such a thing as collective consciousness, which exists beyond individual consciousness and beyond the sum total of individual consciousnesses in a society, then we have to raise the question of the agency. Is there a collective subject or spirit which exists, which is the bearer of collective consciousness? Now, that's not what Durkheim believes, and that might have been believed by some people. Some people might find something similar to it, but I don't think it's correct to attribute to them. But in Hegel, Marx, or Rousseau, you can find something like that, even though I don't think that it's correct to attribute it to. But in Durkheim, you don't have it. You don't have this conception of collective agency, collective subject. So how come we have a consciousness sans subject? So you have collective consciousness, but there is no. And that's because individual consciousness and individual actions and interactions of different types, institutions, material structures, etc., which are actually done by individuals or interaction of individuals, they can, once they are done, and to do them we need some sort of agency. That's why we draw on individual agency or interaction between different individuals. But once those actions are done, once I've written a book, once I have erected a building, once I have come up with certain ideas, once I have written a poem, so they did need agency to come into existence, obviously. But once I have done that, even though they don't have their own agency, they can use or they can exert independent influence on an individual or collection of individuals. So an idea which was uttered by somebody, so that person is the author of that idea, but once they have uttered that, it doesn't need that person for its continued existence. It can exert an independent influence on the mind of other individuals, and even on the same individual. So from this we learn that there can be a collective consciousness such that it is not the sum total of individual interaction, because human interactions and human actions in all forms, once they have been created, once they have been initiated, take their own independent existence, and they are able to exert their influence on those individuals in turn without any appeal to any further agency. So in a sense, collective consciousness in this way can come into being and exert its influence without a recourse to or without a presupposition of a collective subject. And I believe that when people like Adam Smith, for example, talk about when Adam Smith talk about invisible hand, or Hegel talk about cunning of reason. Hegel was for sure influenced by Adam Smith's idea of invisible hand. They are talking about this phenomenon where actions and ideas and institutions initiated by individuals and their interaction take in an independent form, and then this independent form in turn influences and determine to a certain extent the action of those same individuals. So my own words and my own actions come to haunt me, and we can use this mechanism to I'm just giving you an idea. I haven't explained it fully. I'm not going to explain it fully. I'm not going to be able to explain it fully. But I'm just giving you an idea of how to think of collective consciousness without collective agency. So there is a collective consciousness, and it has its own independent reality, but we don't need to presuppose a collective subject. This subject for it. This collective consciousness comes out of it. The actions of individuals and actions of interaction among individuals. But once it is formed, then it in turn determines the actions of those very same a same individual. So this was the first point, and I think the most difficult point, and I'm sure we need much more work on this. Now, we can go on from here fairly straightforward to our second point, which is collective consciousness, in a sense, is common to all individuals in a society. But I assume that, firstly, it doesn't determine everyone in society to the same extent. And I think that's fairly straightforward to accept this point, because collective consciousness would have I would assume that collective consciousness would have a different determining power or influencing power over an educated person as against uneducated person, by the level of education, by the level of a person's personality, irrespective of education, by the level of their skepticism, etc., etc. So it doesn't, although collective consciousness is common to all people to a certain extent, in the sense that it influences people's action in a society, and determines their ideas and consciousnesses in a society, doesn't do it to the same extent. So that's an empirical question, I think. And the second point is, although individual consciously and unconsciously shape collective consciousness, not everybody has an equal contribution to that. And my reason for this is the same as my reason for the point about different level of determination of collective consciousness, how collective consciousness determine different individuals to a different degree. And just my I would say my general rule of thumb is, for myself, I think that in any society, most people basically follow the norm, which is set by collective consciousness. And then there are two minorities. One is the minority which is actively supportive of that particular collective consciousness. And then depending on and that's an empirical question, depending on society's cohesion and coherence, there's always a minority which is opposed to that. So that's the second point. Let's see how much. Okay. And the third point is that collective consciousness fixes sacred and profane in a society. Both in secular societies and religious societies. So collective consciousness is basically determines what a society considers its existential foundations. So whenever those foundations seem to be violated, then there's an outrage, there is an outcry, etc. So this is the third point. The fourth point is collective consciousness is not static. It is any society. Collective consciousness is not static. It is changing, it's forming, it's developing. So it is dynamic, but its very nature makes us assume that, and I think is correct assumption, that changes in collective consciousness are slow, and especially in its core of collective consciousness of a society are slow to change. And if that core changes, then my fifth point is that then there's a revolution in a society, and you have another society going to emerge sooner or later with a different sets of collective consciousness. But you can have slow changes in a society, without radically affecting the core of a collective consciousness, without a revolution. And I guess different collective consciousnesses have different degree of room or space for reform without, succumbing to a revolution. So that's an empirical point, I would say. And the sixth point, which I think I take from Durkheim, in a sense, that modern societies, like modern societies, and we did a video on this before, like pre-modern societies, in modern societies, like pre-modern societies, individual consciousness is determined by, not just determined by, constituted by, so it's not deterministic as such, determined by collective consciousness. So in that sense, there's no difference between modern and pre-modern society, because if a society can't exist without collective consciousness, then that is a tautological statement in a sense. But and here's the big but for Durkheim, and this continuation of the point 6, that collective consciousness has a much looser, not loser, what's the word I want? Much loose or less firm hold on individual consciousness. That we saw in, the distinction we did a video on, the difference between mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity. So modern society, like other societies, individual consciousness is determined by collective consciousness. But what differentiates modern society, according to Durkheim, from pre-modern societies is that the hold of collective consciousness on individual is much looser, or much less firm, less tight than in other societies. So in other words, there is a much more room for individual for freedom in modern societies, and that's why the specter of anarchy and all those things which Durkheim talk about. Some of that, I agree with, and some of them I don't agree with, which I'm not going to deal with it here. So that was our 6th point. But here, I'll diverge a bit from Durkheim in the sense that I would argue that because in modern societies the hold of collective consciousness on individual consciousness much loose and less determined, for this, and individuals have more freedom, more individualism. For this very reason, modern societies need to and they do actively and on a continuous basis, they need to produce and reproduce collective consciousness. So what I'm arguing is that because there is more freedom, there's more individualism, modern societies need to manage individuals more through various means, and one of those means is creation and recreation of collective consciousness on a constant basis. And this doesn't need to be done in pre-modern societies because they have collective consciousness is already very strong. They don't need to do that, and there are different tools for that. You can say it's a 0.8 or just a subpoint of 0.7. One of them is education. Then you have media of different sorts, newspapers, like as Hegel famously said, to be modern to read a morning newspaper or something like that. And by media we mean popular media, academic media, etc. And just with education, one thing which we should note is that pre-industrial societies, and I think Gellner has made this point somewhere, that in pre-modern societies, education is limited to few people. The scribes and all those religious people. On the other hand, skills are universals. Everybody has some sort of skills they inherit from their family to earn their livelihood. But in modern societies, totally opposite. Education is universal. On the other hand, skill is limited to, professional class. And why is that? Because in modern society, education is needed to produce collective consciousness. So that's why you need to put people into primary school and keep them until... I don't think this is done consciously, but, the function is very clear. So here's my last point, and this is what I call the paradox of modern societies. Paradox of modern individualism, modern individualism of which Durkheim, speaks so much. And this paradox, the paradox is this: because collective consciousness is weak in modern society, and that's what defines modern societies according to Durkheim, and that's why there's more individualism. But because of this very individualism, there is a need of more collective producing stronger versions of collective consciousness than the pre-modern societies ever required. In other words, because people are free, we need to manage them more. If they were less free, we didn't need that much management. That's one reason anyway. That's not the whole story, but that's my thesis. And I'll stop here, and maybe next time we'll pick up some of the points which remain underdeveloped in this, and we'll develop them a bit more thoroughly. Thank you.